Hi, I'm Wes, the Explosion, and a while back I was scrolling Twitter when I came across the post that said, Mega Man is the only game series that constantly does throwbacks to parts of their games that sucked ass. And you're wrong. Lots of series do this, though I'll give you that Mega Man might be the biggest offender. It was an interesting point though, and I found myself poking around the thread, seeing what other elements people wish Capcom would have left by the wayside. A lot of them didn't surprise me too much, but most of them I also didn't consider mistakes. So I thought it'd be fun to give some of these gimmicks a look and give my own opinions on whether I think they're a major selling point, or something that should have been abandoned long ago. Let's start off with an obvious one, the disappearing or Yoku blocks, and whether these are clever or suck can really vary in my opinion. I think for a disappearing block section to be good, they need two things. The first is there needs to be a noticeable sound when they appear, a whoop, 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 or what have you. In fact, tacking onto that, there should be a steady rhythm highlighted by the sound effect. You should be able to predict when one set will disappear and another appear. If there's too much space between sets, making you question whether you have 1 or 2 seconds before the next, you're being more obnoxious than clever. And if I'm not making stupid noises in tandem with the game, well, you're just screwing with me at this point. With the next component, you get a choice. Either the entire puzzle needs to be on screen at once, or it needs to have a natural flow, which I guess in general we could say that they need to be predictable. There's a lot of patterns with multiple solutions and/or redundant blocks. I can kind of enjoy studying a sequence and then coming up with a solution, but I ain't such a savant that I can do it at a glance. If there's an enemy in the way, I'll take it out so that the blocks are all I need to concentrate on. Some sequences, though, stretch out over wide chasms, further than you can see, and that's fine, as long as you're not punished for not knowing the pattern already. If all you need to do is keep moving with no option to retreat and the pace isn't too crazy, it can feel really harrowing, and who doesn't feel cool after making a narrow escape? Not all of them do this though. There's some that, like I said, unless you know the pattern, you'll just die. There's this one advancing sequence in Dr. Wily's Revenge where one block will appear over your head, trapping you on the previous block which waits to drop you into the spikes, if you don't jump right before it shows up. I've seen this sort of thing before and had a sinking feeling, so I was able to avoid the trap, but for most players, this is a death sentence, through no fault of their own, other than lacking precognition. This is what I'd call a bad challenge. Then there's the blocks in X-Dive, which are not only very quiet, but are also super spaced out and pop up in no particular order. And while they probably won't get you killed, they do feel really drawn out and boring. And annoying. I'll also say that they shouldn't be so terribly complex that you fry your brain trying to memorize them, and they also get bonus points if there's a way to skip them. While in part, it's because not everyone likes the blocks, and giving them an out is nice, and hey, sometimes even I'm not in the mood, it's also because I think part of the appeal of these is feeling clever, and what makes you feel more clever than using the oddball wire item to get up to a ladder, or throwing Rush down in the spikes and jumping with him to swing around the block sequence. So I think the disappearing blocks are good, but only as good as the person programming them in. Seeing the Devils, Yellow called out by name, was no surprise, and these are another one that I think can vary wildly in quality. Also wouldn't blame anyone who hated them all, since they do tend to be pretty hard. I think I've only fought exactly one easy devil, but hey, let's compare and contrast. I did a video on the Yellow Devil recently, where I talked about the original and the remake versions. Check it out if you're interested. But to sum things up, I love Mega Man 1's Devil, since it's a boss you can react to, learn from, and even opt out of, with a glitch. Compare that to Powered Up, where the fight is slow and just memorization rather than skill. So even with the same boss, you get the good and the bad. And it's similar with the Green Devil. In 8, it has some pretty funky attack patterns to keep you on your toes, and the way you damage it, punching through its goo and then striking the control core, give you some interesting options. You can chew through with Flash Bomb, hit it with the weakness Thunderclaw, or rip right past with Laser Buster. It's fun to mess around with. Then they recycle it in Mega Man and Bass and it just stands there, sliding slime your way, and you still have to dig into its core. It just takes a bit, so it's kind of a boring fight in my opinion. Probably doesn't help that it's the intro boss for some dumb reason, meaning that they can't do anything too crazy with it and you're limited to just your starting buster. As for the rest, there's more hits and misses. I like Twin Devil but hate Block, since I can read the former's trajectories pretty easily, but it feels a little more random with the latter, not to mention how it takes your floor space away. And while I've heard some like the Shadow Devil, I think the fight feels a little drawn out and it can be hard to get at the eye with Zero. Rainbow feels a lot better to fight though, with you having the choice between Sword and Buster and other stuff, as an extra point in its favor. On the whole, I love Devils, so I hope we keep seeing them, but you need to be very careful when creating the actual fight. Otherwise, they can be a pretty miserable experience. Heck, even a well-executed one can be too much for some, so you also really gotta consider how much you want to expect from your players as well. Now this one surprised me to see. While I either agree or at least understand why people would dislike the rest of these, doesn't everyone enjoy a boss rush? Well, maybe that's too sweeping a statement, but I always really like them. When you first face a boss in Mega Man or any game, you don't have your full suite of abilities, and if it's your first time playing, you need to learn how the boss works, their patterns, and what weapons are effective and the like. Chances are, there'll be a decent challenge on your first encounter, but on the rematch, not only should you have all your powers and any tanks you manage to squirrel away, but you should also be a lot better at the game. It's a good way to see how far you've come, and blowing through all 8 bosses always makes me feel like a badass. Plus, the Robot Masters or Mavericks or Navis are always one of the big highlights of every game, so seeing them all in marathon format is really exciting. Then again, circumstances can kind of make your mileage vary. Sometimes these capsule rooms come in after a stretch of stage, sometimes they're paired up with the final boss, sometimes there's just that one boss that's really hard to beat, all on their own, making the situation stressful, since screwing up can lead to you doing the whole sequence over again. While I think boss rushes are fun, too much repetition can kill your buzz. I love Charge Man, but with how quick he can move, sometimes randomly, combined with how many of his attacks make him invulnerable, I have had him mess up my endgame in 5. I like the damage animations in 7, but seeing them over and over again after losing to the Wily capsule makes them lose a lot of their appeal. Similar situation in 0-1, just throw in unskippable dialogue. Oh, and another thing that's great about these situations is that you get health back after every fight. Typically not a full heal, but a good chunk. Not only does this give you a good bit of wiggle room, you not having to be perfect, just pretty good, but it also adds in a strategic element. Typically, if I can suss out which boss is in which capsule, I'll be sure to fight the toughest when I'm at full, and save the weaker ones when I need to make up lost ground. For example, Ringman at full, then if I'm hurting, I try to go for Toadman. But then you get powered up, when you have to fight all 8 bosses, back to back, but with no refills in between. Mega Man is mostly fine, but geez, with everybody else, you'll be doing less damage than most of your opponents. This can sometimes be hard even on easy mode. And if I remember correctly, this is also why I quit Street Fighter X Mega Man, since they were too pathetic to take on Megs on even ground. So I like boss rushes for the most part, but I will admit, they can be fumbled. And this one's my pick, the drop platforms from Gutsman's stage. They show up 3 times that I know of. The ones from Mega Man 1 are infamous. They move back and forth along these rails, and the bottom drops out over the breaks in the path. Due to, I think, a programming error, you drop like a rock, much faster than usual if you don't manage to get airborne when they do. Not that it matters much, you'd be pretty much screwed regardless, but the fast fall certainly makes it feel even more panicky, at least for me. There's also different levels to them that you need to jump between, so you need to be paying attention not just to the rail you're on, but also the next one you need to leap to, and sometimes it can be hard to line these up properly. These can be pretty difficult to navigate and are probably the biggest source of early game rage quits. In challenge mode, I'll personally just use the magnet beam to travel over them, but in the game proper, I take down Guts before Elect, so I typically have to do these fair and square, and they were pretty hard for me when I started out, but I can do them relatively consistently these days. Doesn't mean I like them though, and that goes doubly so in the remake. The levels have been remixed, and while I could be imagining things, some of the jumps feel a lot tighter here, meaning that they took something people already griped about and made it even more aggravating. Not only that, but the final stage even has a segment where the gaps in the path are even wider, meaning, unless you have some way to cheese it, like Gutsman's blocks, or activating time stop in the air to stay in place for an extra second, it requires more or less perfect timing. There is an easy extra life earlier in the stage, which means that you probably won't game over here, but it does drag out the timer in a game where clear time plays a big part in your score. There's one more time this shows up though, in Shadowman.exe's stage in Network Transmission, and it's the simplest version of the trap. There's just a few sequences of the drop platforms in the last section of the level, the timing isn't too tight, and there's only one part where you have to jump down from one to another. The rest are just horizontal. On top of all that, you have options. While you need to find and put them in your folder, there are double jump chips, which you can hold up to 10 of. If you pull that and keep it on hand, even if you flub your jump, you can just use another, even without touching a platform. Multiple in a row, in fact, if you farmed enough. There's also one section of the drop platforms that you can just use a handrail to get over, giving you another out for at least a portion of it. So if I were to recommend one level with this hazard to visit, it would be this. Overall though, I don't much care for these and am glad that it's not as overdone as everything else we've talked about. Overdone sounds negative, let's say reused. At the very least, these should be kept for endgame, not regular stages. Which I guess is a good rule of thumb for most of this stuff. Now on to the tweet that started it all, which was a comment on another post, with a short vid where someone does a pretty impressive job skirting around the security lasers in X5, only to blow it with a flubbed input a little before the end. And yeah, I don't much care for security lasers. I've complained about them in the past, that and Boo Beam being the main two reasons why I don't like Mega Man 2 as much as most people do. I still think it's pretty darn good though, jeez. Anyway, while this doesn't come back as often as some of the other things on the list, it still does a fair bit. Patient Zero is Mega Man 2 of course. As you hop down onto the next screen, insta-kill beams start closing in from the sides, starting with the ones at the top. You need to move further down as quickly and efficiently as possible, no taking a moment to get your bearings. Even if you pause, which would normally show you an unpopulated version of the screen, here, you'll just get a black void. Because of this, you pretty much need to have the stage memorized. If you don't fall in an optimal spot, getting over the next ledge will take too long and you'll die. Sure, like Ego Raptor's video points out, there are sections that are shaped in a way that kind of guide your fall to teach you the mechanics, but that's only at the beginning of the stage. The later examples often require perfection. Or the time stopper. I do kinda like that they give you a pretty nasty problem and then hand you a solution, assuming you take out Flash first, but there's still some frustration even then. You can't turn Time Stopper off once activated. That makes it so that using it is an all or nothing prospect, which kinda makes sense. If you could just flip it on and off, it'd be really easy to get through. You using it to give yourself an extra second here, an extra 2 there, really blunting the threat the lasers present. It also adds a good bit of pressure since if you use it too early, it could run out before you hit the end, and you could end up wasting it. It actually is a pretty good way to balance the option, I have to admit. I still just want to whine a little bit about how it can be annoying to get past the traps and then just have to wait for the energy to run out as you stare at a Joe in a walker, and how frustrating it can be if you waste your full bar and then die anyway. The bigger issue might be that Time Stopper is the most effective tool against Quickman. I am not using Crash Bomb. It's an interesting trade-off. I just wish it was against a different boss, since having to choose between beating the hardest stage and the hardest Robot Master is a real conundrum. I've heard some people defend the security lasers, and I've done it myself without Time Stopper, so I can see the appeal. It does feel really good to pull off, but for anyone playing this for the first time, heck, even those who have done several runs, it's pretty stressful. If I had to sum it up, I'd say it's a good challenge for hardcore. It has some interesting give and take, but still pretty tough if you come prepared, and it's the sort of thing that will feel really unfair, possibly to the point of getting some people to drop the game, to those blindsided by it. Luckily, it is pretty infamous at this point. Turbo Man also gets a short section that's similar, but I often forget about it until I'm there, so it might be the best one. Then there's the instance cited by the tweet, from X5's endgame. Rather than just starting up right as you drop down, these are motion-based. Walk in front of the projectors and the trap activates. First part of the section is vertical, then later it's horizontal. They travel faster than you can walk, even dash, and a good number of the sources lurk just off screen. So once you get into it, you probably just want to keep moving through the obvious path. The second part, with the lasers above you, you just kinda want to move fast under each, no loitering. and this might be even more brutal than 2s. The lasers are so fast that not only do you need to fall perfectly, you need to be trying to outrun the next before you even hit the ground. But if you try to cut corners too much, you won't fall, you'll wall slide and get clipped by the current laser instead. While I can get through Quickman's segment naked if need be, here, after playing the section over and over, knowing exactly where the lasers are, I still just can't seem to move fast enough to get through the long vertical section. Yeah, go ahead with your skill issue comments, I'm still gonna say this is unreasonable. Of course, to get to this level, you're likely going to have the Darkhold, X5's time stopper, and the only people who don't are likely to be speedrunners who skip the main game, who also won't need it to complete this section. It might actually slow them down. Checkpoints are also pretty generous here. Game overs keep you at the one you're at, unless you opt out, plus weapon ammo also refills in between, so you don't need to worry about wasting your Darkhold and blowing your only chance. Maybe that much wiggle room is why they made these traps so damn unforgiving. I'll say that the whole issue where you can easily run out of Darkhold before you hit bottom is still a real possibility, and there's a delay when you use it, unlike Time Stopper, so you need to plan ahead, you can't just save it for when you get in a bad position. You can also knock the difficulty down to easy to decrease the number of lasers in the stage, then change back once you're done. Did this for the Quickman achievement, thank you random YouTube video who pointed this out. But yeah, while I had my complaints with the first iteration, this one still requires perfect movements, but now, the way the screen's set up and how fast they move, you can't see where the hazards are coming from as far in advance, and the timing's so tight that memorizing the path isn't as reliable. I hate it, but the one nice thing I can say is that at least they saved this for endgame. Network transmission has our last example, and it's the worst of all. You have to move downwards, very deliberately. However, while you can hear the lasers, which go off in a sequence after you step in front of the first one, most of them are just off screen, out of sight. The only way you're gonna see them ahead of time is if you're hugging a wall, which means you're probably already dead. There's also a lot of platforms you can get caught on, even if you can't wall slide. There's also some collectibles in the maze, which you have to keep an eye out for, otherwise you'll have to come back or just give up on them. There's nothing good about this one. It was a Quickman.exe stage, so they put in Quickman lasers, without any effort being put into level design. About the only neat thing I can mention is that the lasers aren't insta-kill. They just do so much damage that you probably won't be able to live a hit until very late game. It also doesn't have a time stop, and it really needed one. At least more than 2 did. Scouting a path is really the only solution, and you really just need to bang your head against the wall until you figure out the optimal path, then pull it off. There's a few fan games that include these as well. I know at least one of the Rosenkreuzlich do, but Virtual Unlimited Project is probably the only one to contain a set I like. These start out with X5, you see a cannon that, when you walk across its path, it fires the laser. And yeah, some of them are off screen, but each has a red trip beam, like in the spy movies, that you can see ahead of time, so that you won't end up just stumbling into a trap that you had no idea was there. There are also sets that twist. The laser will pass through a filter that then turns it 90 degrees to continue chasing you, which highlights another aspect of these. You move fast enough that you can actually outrun them. Even if you land in front of them in a disadvantageous position, you can still get yourself out of it if you're quick enough. And if you don't, well, the lasers take a chunk out of your health, rather than being instantly killed for a minor mistake. What I like so much about this is that you can just take each hazard as they come. With the others, there's a need to scout out the path and carefully pull off your movements, making it feel more like you're cracking a code, which is kind of an interesting concept. The EXE stage actually takes place in a bank, and these do kind of feel like you're busting into a vault. You could even look at stuff like the Time Stopper as a way of hacking the system. But with how tight the timing is and how failure, especially with game overs, result in a loss of progress, for me at least, I'd rather do without. But with Virtual Unlimited Project, you have the signs to plan ahead, you're fast enough comparatively to the lasers that you can actually react to them, and even if you do make a slight mistake, the punishment isn't having to do the whole sequence over again. While there is a part of me that would be interested in a game that's just a collection of security lasers that you need to scout out and then plot the perfect route through, when I'm playing a platformer, I want my skill or ingenuity to be what carries me through, not a bunch of trial and error. At the end of the day, I don't think I'm saying anything too crazy. The execution, more than the concept, is what's important with a lot of these. Thus why I have good and bad examples of the same things. While I think that challenges that require skill are better, I also don't think that throwing in memorization is a bad thing, I just think that the punishment needs to be appropriate. Insta-kills are fine as long as you have enough warning, but if it's the result of you not instantly knowing the entire level's layout, that's a whole lot of bunk. Thus, disappearing blocks that make you start the sequence over again, or bosses that slap you around a bit the first time, but expect you to be on the top of your game for the rematch are fair, but lasers that kill you for not dropping in perfectly, or extended block sequences with nasty tricks over pits are not. I also have to admit, with as much as I like and play these games, I might also have more of a tolerance for them than the average person. I only recently found out that not everyone likes the Doc robots. Really? But they're so cool! Some of these elements might grate on people more if they wind up getting too many game overs, and have to keep repeating the same level. Probably pretty telling that I was harsh on the security lasers, and it's also worth mentioning that I thought about discussing whether the whole live system is necessary, but that applies to a lot more than just Mega Man. I guess this is probably a good time to ask, are there any other recurring elements that I should have included here, and what do you think about the ones I picked out? Anyway, that'll do it for this week, so thanks as always for watching, and maybe consider subscribing if you're into platformers, especially Mega Man. Also, since I couldn't think of anywhere else to mention this, isn't it kind of interesting that X5 and Network Transmission were the two games that show up the most here? Both were relevant in all but one each.